The marble floors of the Hamilton County Courthouse reflected the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows as Judge Victoria Lawson walked through the main entrance in casual clothes, her judicial robes folded neatly in a leather bag over her shoulder, unaware that in exactly 4 minutes, 2 police officers would have their hands on her arms, dragging her toward the exit while dozens of people watched in silence. The security checkpoint that she'd passed through hundreds of times suddenly became foreign territory when Officer Bradley Mitchell looked at her jeans and Howard University t-shirt instead of her face, saw her brown skin instead of her credentials, and made an assumption that would cost him more than just his morning coffee break. "Ma'am, you can't be in here," he said, his hand already moving to his radio, calling for backup for a situation that existed only in his imagination, while Victoria stood there holding the very badge that gave her more authority in this building than he would ever possess. Victoria had arrived early that Tuesday morning to prepare for the Patterson case, a complex custody battle where a black father was fighting against a system predisposed to doubt him, a case that reminded her why she'd become a judge after 15 years as a civil rights attorney. Her car was in the shop, so she'd taken a bus, entering through the public entrance instead of the judge's private parking garage, wearing civilian clothes because she always changed into her robes in her chambers, a routine she'd maintained since her first day on the bench 3 years ago. The security scanner beeped when she walked through, her judicial badge still in her bag, and that's when Officer Mitchell stepped forward with the kind of aggressive certainty that comes from never having his assumptions challenged. If you've ever been judged by your appearance rather than your character, if you've ever had to prove you belong in spaces you've earned the right to occupy, then you understand the fire that began building in Victoria's chest as she reached for her bag to show her credentials. Share this story and subscribe to Acts of Depth, where we witness moments when truth confronts prejudice and justice refuses to stay silent. "I'm Judge Lawson," Victoria said calmly, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used when maintaining order in her courtroom. "I preside in courtroom 7. If you'll just let me show you my—" But Mitchell had already decided what he was seeing. A black woman who didn't look like his idea of a judge, who must be lying, who was probably trying to disrupt proceedings or worse. His partner, Officer Derek Santos, appeared beside him, both men moving with the synchronized prejudice of those who mistaken their biases for intuition. "Ma'am, you need to leave immediately, or we'll have to escort you out." Victoria's mind flashed to her father, William Lawson, who'd been the first black police chief in their small Michigan town, who'd taught her that dignity in the face of ignorance was not weakness, but strategy. She could see his photograph in her office upstairs, standing proud in his uniform, the same uniform worn by men who'd pulled him over countless times when he was off duty, refusing to believe he was their superior until he showed them proof. He prepared her for this moment without knowing it, teaching her that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice was to let it fully reveal itself before striking back with truth. "Officers, I'm asking you once more to let me show you my identification," Victoria said, her hands visible and non-threatening, aware that other people in the courthouse lobby were beginning to notice the confrontation. A young black mother with 2 children quickly ushered them toward the exit, her eyes meeting Victoria's with a mixture of sympathy and familiar exhaustion. 2 white lawyers in expensive suits paused to watch, their expressions curious but not concerned, as if viewing a mildly interesting disruption to their morning routine. The inequality of the moment, who was seen as threat versus nuisance, was not lost on Victoria. Mitchell's hand moved her arm, not quite grabbing but making contact, crossing a line that transformed the situation from misunderstanding to assault. "Ma'am, we're not going to ask again." Santos flanked her other side, and Victoria made a decision that would later be debated in legal ethics classes across the country. She chose to let them continue, to let their assumptions carry them to their logical conclusion, because sometimes the only way to expose a broken system is to let it break itself against the truth. She could have screamed, could have demanded they call the chief judge, could have resisted. But instead she said quietly, "When you realize what you're doing, remember that I gave you 3 chances to stop." The officers took her silence as submission, each gripping one of her arms as they began walking her toward the exit. The courthouse lobby, usually filled with the buzz of legal proceedings and whispered consultations, fell silent except for the echo of footsteps on marble. Victoria kept her head high, making eye contact with everyone who watched, memorizing faces, particularly noting which court employees, people who should have recognized her, chose to look away rather than intervene. The morning sun through the windows cast long shadows, and Victoria found herself thinking absurdly about the Patterson case files waiting on her desk, about the father who wouldn't get justice today because the judge was being escorted out of her own courthouse. 20 feet from the door, Victoria saw Marshall Henderson, the district attorney who'd argued cases in her courtroom just last week, and she watched the exact moment recognition dawn on his face, his coffee cup stopping halfway to his lips, his eyes widening as his brain tried to reconcile the scene before him with what he knew to be true. "Wait," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Officers, wait. That's..." But Mitchell, deep in the momentum of his own authority, dismissed him with barely a glance. "Sir, please step back. We have the situation under control." The phrase "under control" echoed in Victoria's mind, carrying with the weight of every time she'd heard those words used to justify the unjustifiable. She thought of the defendants who'd stood before her bench, particularly the young black men who'd been brought in with stories of mistaken identity, excessive force, assumptions made and acted upon before questions were asked. She'd listened to their testimonies with judicial neutrality, but now she was living their truth, feeling the grip of hands that had decided her guilt before examining the evidence. Her Howard University T-shirt, worn with pride for her alma mater, had become evidence against her in a crime she hadn't committed, the crime of existing while black in a space they decided she didn't belong. Santos's radio crackled with routine courthouse business, and Victoria heard her own name mentioned. Judge Lawson's 9 a.m. hearing in courtroom 7 needs to be delayed. She hasn't arrived yet. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so tragically common. She was literally being dragged past the elevator that would take her to her courtroom while they wondered where she was. "Officers," she said, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge of steel, "you're about to create a situation that will follow you for the rest of your careers. I am Judge Victoria Lawson. My credentials are in my bag. Check them now." But Mitchell had crossed the threshold from mistake to pride, the point where admitting error becomes harder than doubling down on wrongness. "Ma'am, anyone can claim to be a judge. You're trespassing in a federal building, and if you continue to resist, we'll have to add that to the charges." The word charges hung in the air like a threat made real, and Victoria felt the familiar weight of how quickly a black person could go from citizen to criminal in the span of a misunderstanding. She could see the headline already. "Woman arrested for impersonating judge," with her mugshot spread across social media before the truth could catch up. That's when she saw Clara, her court clerk for the past 2 years, emerging from the elevator with an armload of files. Clara's face went pale as she took in the scene, her mouth opening in shock. "Oh my God, Judge Lawson." She dropped the files, paper scattering across the marble floor like white flags of surrender. "Officers, what are you doing? That's Judge Lawson. She's supposed to be on the bench in 10 minutes. But the officers' grip only tightened, their minds unable to process information that contradicted the story they'd already written. Victoria noticed how Mitchell's jaw clenched at Clara's words, how his eyes darted between her face and the exit, calculating whether to continue forward or acknowledge his mistake. She recognized the look. She'd seen it in defendants who'd been caught but couldn't admit guilt, in witnesses who'd lied and were deciding whether to double down or come clean. "Clara," Victoria said clearly, "please call Chief Judge Morrison and tell him that Officers Mitchell and Santos are removing me from the building. Tell him to meet us at the front entrance." The mention of Chief Judge Morrison, a name that carried weight even in Mitchell's authority-drunk mind, caused a first crack in his certainty. His pace slowed slightly, but his grip remained firm, as if his hands hadn't received the message his brain was beginning to process. Santos looked between his partner and Victoria, and she saw something shift in his expression, the dawning realization that they might have grabbed a tiger by the tail. "Brad," Santos said quietly, "maybe we should—" "No!" Mitchell cut him off, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. They were now in the courthouse's main atrium, where a small crowd had gathered, phones out, recording everything. Victoria recognized several attorneys, a few clerks, and most importantly, Judge Robertson from the criminal division, who was practically running toward them in his robes, his face a mask of disbelief and growing anger. "Officers, you will release Judge Lawson immediately." Judge Chen's voice boomed across the atrium. This is a gross violation of protocol and basic decency. The atrium had become an amphitheater of accountability, with every phone camera serving as witness to what happened when assumption met authority. Victoria felt Mitchell's grip loosen slightly at Judge Chen's words, but he still didn't let go, caught in that terrible space between recognition and admission where pride battles truth. "Sir, this woman was causing a disturbance," Mitchell said, his voice now defensive rather than aggressive. She refused to leave when asked. The lie came so easily that Victoria wondered how many times he'd used it before, how many people without her credentials had been removed from places they had every right to be. Judge Chen's face darkened with each word. "Officer Mitchell, I can see your name badge. Judge Lawson has presided in this courthouse for 3 years. She's scheduled to hear the Patterson custody case in exactly 7 minutes. You are physically assaulting a federal judge." He pulled out his own phone, not to record but to call. "Chief Morrison, you need to come to the main atrium immediately. We have a situation." The weight of those words, "We have a situation," finally penetrated Mitchell's consciousness, and his hands fell away from Victoria's arms as if they'd suddenly become burning metal. Victoria stood perfectly still for a moment, feeling the absence of their grip like phantom pain, then slowly, deliberately, reached into her leather bag. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath as she pulled out her judicial identification badge, the gold shield catching the morning sunlight streaming through the skylights. She held it up, not frantically or aggressively, but with the same measured movement she used when entering evidence into record. "Judge Victoria Lawson," she read aloud, her voice carrying across the now silent atrium. "Appointed to the Family Court Division of Hamilton County. Sworn in 3 years, 4 months, and 12 days ago." Santos physically stepped backward, his face draining of color as the magnitude of their error crashed over him like a wave. But Mitchell, still clinging to the wreckage of his authority, tried one last deflection. "You should have shown that immediately. How are we supposed to know?" The question hung in the air like an indictment of everything wrong with the assumption that black people must always prove their right to exist in professional spaces, that the burden of proof always falls on those being profiled rather than those doing the profiling. "I tried to show you 3 times, Victoria said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her judicial authority. "You chose not to look. You saw my skin color, my casual clothes, and made a decision about who I could and couldn't be. You didn't see a judge because you decided what judges look like, and I didn't fit your image." She turned to address the growing crowd, many of whom were court employees who'd watched it being dragged past without intervening. "How many of you recognize me, but stayed silent? How many times does this happen to people who don't have a badge to prove they belong?" Chief Judge Morrison arrived like a storm in black robes, his usually composed face twisted with a combination of fury and mortification. At 72, James Morrison had served the courthouse for 30 years, and Victoria had never seen him this angry. "Officers, you will report to my chambers immediately after Judge Lawson decides how she wants to proceed." He turned to Victoria, his voice softening. "Judge Lawson, I am deeply, deeply sorry. This is inexcusable." But Victoria wasn't looking at him. She was watching a young black girl, maybe 16, who'd been watching from the corner with what looked like her mother, probably here for a family court matter. And the girl's eyes held a mixture of vindication and sadness, as if she'd just seen confirmation of everything her mother had warned her about. Victoria walked over to the girl, ignoring the crowd, the cameras, the stammering apologies beginning to flow from Santos. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The girl straightened slightly. Jasmine Williams." Victoria smiled, the first genuine expression she'd shown since entering the building. "Jasmine, what you just witnessed was wrong. But what matters is what happens next. Change doesn't come from hiding injustice. It comes from exposing it to light." She pulled a business card from her bag. "If you ever want to learn about law, about how to fight this system from within, call me." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of 3 more security supervisors and someone Victoria recognized as the courthouse's head of human resources. Mitchell and Santos were being surrounded by their own supervisors, the power dynamic shifting so rapidly it was almost dizzying. But Victoria's attention was caught by something else. Several of the white attorneys who'd been watching were now approaching the officers' supervisors, apparently offering themselves as witnesses. She heard fragments, completely inappropriate, obvious racial profiling. We saw everything. The same voices that had been silent during the act were now loud in its aftermath. Victoria glanced at her watch. 9:05 a.m. The Patterson case was waiting. A black father sitting in her courtroom, wondering if justice would show up today, unaware that justice had almost been physically removed from the building. "Chief Morrison," she said, cutting to the chaos with her judge's voice, "I need 10 minutes to change into my robes and compose myself. The Patterson family has waited long enough for their day in court. We can address this situation after I fulfill my duties to them." The choice to prioritize her courtroom over her own situation sent a ripple through the crowd. This was what actual judicial integrity looked like. As she walked toward the elevator, the crowd parted like water, some with phones still recording, others with eyes averted in shame. Clara had gathered the scattered files and fell into step beside her, tears streaming down her face. "Judge Lawson, I'm so sorry. I should have come down sooner. I should have—" Victoria stopped her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Clara, you spoke up when you saw it. That's more than most did. Now let's go do what we came here to do. Serve justice." The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt like ascending from one world to another. In the reflection of the polished steel doors, Victoria could see the red marks on her arms where the officers had gripped her, physical evidence of what had just occurred. She thought of her father again, how he'd come home some nights with similar marks hidden under his uniform, never complaining but teaching her through his silence that dignity sometimes meant enduring injustice while working to change it from within. She pulled out her phone and saw that videos of the incident were already spreading on social media. The courthouse's shameful moment going viral in real time. Her chambers were exactly as she'd left them the evening before. Case files neatly stacked, her father's photograph on the desk, her spare robe hanging behind the door. As she changed, transforming from a woman who'd been dragged to the courthouse to the judge who commanded respect in it, she thought about the duality every black professional navigated daily. The robe was armor, but it shouldn't have to be. She shouldn't need a uniform to be treated with basic dignity. But until that changed, she would use every tool at her disposal to protect others from what she'd just experienced. She entered courtroom 7 at 9:15, only 15 minutes late, to find Mr. Patterson sitting at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, his 2 young children's photographs spread before him. His ex-wife sat at the defendant's table, her lawyer whispering urgently. They'd probably seen the videos already, wondering if what had happened to the judge would affect their case. Victoria took her seat at the bench, the familiar weight of the gavel in her hand, grounding her in purpose. "Good morning. I apologize for the delay. Sometimes justice faces obstacles on its way to this courtroom, but it always arrives." The Patterson case was exactly the kind that reminded Victoria why she'd chosen family court despite other offers. Marcus Patterson, a software engineer, was fighting for equal custody of his children against a system that defaulted to maternal preference and an ex-wife who'd weaponized every stereotype about black fathers. As she listened to testimony, Victoria found herself hyper-aware of every assumption made, every bias revealed in language choices. Mrs. Patterson's attorney actually used a phrase for someone of his background when referring to Marcus's parenting capabilities, and Victoria felt the morning's events crystallizing into sharper focus. "Counselor," Victoria interrupted, her voice carrying new weight after morning's events. "What exactly do you mean by his background?" "Mr. Patterson has a master's degree, no criminal record, and has never missed a child support payment. Please be specific about what background concerns you." The attorney stammered, backtracking, but the damage was done. Victoria saw Marcus Patterson's shoulders straighten slightly, recognizing that he had an ally on the bench who understood what it meant to be prejudged. During a recess, Victoria checked her phone to find dozens of messages. The video from the courthouse had over 1 million views already, with headlines ranging from judge drag from own courthouse to racial profiling in the halls of justice. But one message stood out, from her father, now retired and living in Florida. Just 2 words, "standing proud." He'd taught her that changing systems sometimes meant letting them reveal their flaws publicly, that sunshine was the best disinfectant for institutional prejudice. The Patterson case continued through lunch, and Victoria made sure to give it her full attention despite the chaos undoubtedly unfolding in the administrative offices below. Every ruling she made that day would be scrutinized through the lens of the morning's events, but she refused to let that influence her decisions. Justice couldn't be swayed by viral videos or public pressure. It had to stand on its own merit, just as she'd had to stand on hers when the officers refused to see her credentials. By the time Victoria concluded the Patterson hearing, granting joint custody with a detailed ruling that addressed each bias assumption raised, it was nearly 3 p.m. She returned to her chambers to find Chief Judge Morrison waiting with the courthouse's legal counsel, the police chief, and a woman she recognized as the mayor's chief of staff. The speed of the response told her everything about how far the video had spread. "Judge Lawson," the police chief began, "I want to personally apologize for my officer's actions. This is not representative of how we train." Victoria raised her hand, stopping in mid-sentence. "Chief Davidson, I presided over enough cases to know the difference between individual bias and systemic failure. Officers Mitchell and Santos didn't wake up this morning deciding to assault a judge. They woke up with assumptions about who belongs where, assumptions your department has failed to address." She pulled out her phone, showing them the video that now had 3 million views. "This isn't about 2 officers. It's about why they felt comfortable doing this in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses, in a courthouse full of people who knew who I was but said nothing." The mayor's chief of staff, Catherine Walsh, leaned forward. "Judge Lawson, the mayor wants to assure you that the city takes this seriously. We're prepared to implement immediate reforms." But Victoria was already shaking her head. "Ms. Walsh, I don't want Band-Aid solutions or diversity training that everyone sleeps through. I want structural change." She pulled out a legal pad where she'd been making notes between the Patterson testimony. "Every court employee, from judges to janitors, should have their photos in a database accessible at security. Every officer should undergo regular bias assessment, and there should be a civilian oversight board for courthouse security." Chief Judge Morrison spoke up, his voice heavy with institutional authority. "These are significant changes, Victoria. They'll require budget approval, union negotiations." Victoria met his eyes steadily. "James, how many people enter this courthouse every day believing they'll find justice, only to face the same assumptions that almost had me arrested? The Patterson case I just heard, a black father fighting assumptions about his fitness as a parent. How can we dispense justice when we can't even recognize it when it walks through our own doors?" The police chief shifted uncomfortably. "What about officers Mitchell and Santos? They're currently on administrative leave pending investigation." Victoria had been thinking about this all day, weighing punishment against possibility. "I want them to spend 6 months working with my youth and justice program, the one where we bring high school students from underserved communities to learn about law. Let them see the faces of the young people their assumptions affect. Let them hear the stories of kids who've been profiled, stopped, dismissed. Then we'll discuss their future in courthouse security." Catherine Walsh was typing rapidly on her phone. "The mayor would like to meet with you personally, Judge Lawson. He's also interested in your thoughts on broader criminal justice reform in the city." Victoria almost laughed at how quickly crisis became opportunity in political circles, but she recognized the opening. "Tell the mayor I'll meet with him after I've met with every black and brown court employee who's experienced similar treatment, but didn't have a badge to protect them. Their stories matter more than mine." As the afternoon wore on, Victoria found herself back in the atrium where it had all happened. The courthouse was quieter now, the end-of-day lull settling over the marble halls. She stood where the officers had grabbed her, looking at the spot where she'd held up her badge. A janitor was mopping nearby, an older black man she'd seen for years but never spoken to. He approached her slowly, his weathered face carrying decades of similar stories. "Judge Lawson, I want to thank you. My grandson saw that video. First time he ever saw someone who looks like us make them acknowledge they were wrong." His words carried more weight than all the official apologies combined. "What's your name?" Victoria asked. William Hayes. Been cleaning these halls for 23 years. She extended her hand, judge to janitor, equals in their humanity. Mr. Hayes, in 23 years, how many times have you been questioned about whether you belong here? His laugh was bitter and knowing. Lost count after the first year. But I got used to carrying my ID on a lanyard, making myself small, invisible. You refuse to be invisible. That matters. That evening, Victoria returned to courtroom 7-1 last time. The Patterson family's case files were still on her desk, their happy ending secured despite the morning's chaos. She thought about Marcus Patterson, fighting for his children against assumptions, and realized they'd fought parallel battles that day. Her phone showed dozens of interview requests, speaking invitations, book deal offers. The machinery of turning trauma into content was already spinning. But Victoria's mind was on Jasmine Williams, the teenage girl who'd witnessed everything, who'd seen both the worst and best of the justice system in a single morning. She drafted an email to the school board, proposing a new program where students could shadow judges, learning not just about law, but about the courage required to uphold it. She thought of her father, the first black police chief in their town, and how he'd always said that integration without representation was just decoration. Real change meant people like Jasmine Williams growing up to become Judge Williams, carrying both the weight of history and the power to rewrite it. A week later, when officers Mitchell and Santos reported for their first day with the Youth and Justice Program, they found Victoria already there, not in her robes, but in the same Howard University t-shirt she'd worn that morning. The students, all black and brown kids from neighborhoods where police were more occupying force than protecting presence, sat in a circle, their faces guarded but curious. "Today," Victoria announced, "we're going to talk about assumptions, power, and what happens when those entrusted to protect can't see past their own biases." Mitchell, to his credit, didn't flinch when one student asked directly, "Why did you grab her? What made you so sure she didn't belong?" His answer, halting, uncomfortable, but ultimately honest, became the beginning of a conversation that would continue for months. Santos surprised everyone by sharing his own experience of being profiled as a Latino man before becoming a cop, how he thought the uniform would protect him from assumptions, but had instead made him complicit in perpetuating them. The program evolved beyond punishment into something transformative. The students, initially skeptical, began to see the officers as flawed humans capable of growth rather than irredeemable enemies. The officers, stripped of their authority and faced with the consequences of their assumptions, began to understand that their badges came with responsibility to see beyond their biases. Victoria presided over it all, not as judge but as facilitator, understanding that justice sometimes looked like uncomfortable conversations in a community center rather than verdicts from a bench. 6 months later, at the program's graduation ceremony, Jasmine Williams gave the keynote speech. She'd spent those months shadowing Victoria, learning that law was both shield and sword, protection and weapon, depending on who wielded it. "Judge Lawson taught me that dignity isn't something anyone can take from you," Jasmine said, her voice strong and clear. "It's something you carry, even when hands are on your arms, even when they refuse to see who you are. But she also taught me that surviving injustice isn't enough. We have to transform it." Officer Mitchell, reinstated to a different position after completing the program, approached Victoria after the ceremony. "Judge Lawson, I need to say something. That morning, I didn't see you. I saw my assumptions, my fears, my training that taught me to control first and question later. I can't undo that, but I can spend the rest of my career making sure I see people, really see them before I act." It wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement, and in the work of justice, sometimes that's where change begins. The courthouse installed the photo database Victoria had demanded, implemented the bias training she designed, and created a civilian oversight board she required. But the real change was harder to measure. It lived in the security officers who now paused before making assumptions, in the court employees who spoke up instead of staying silent, in the young people who saw that power could be challenged and changed. The video of Victoria being dragged to the courthouse became teaching material in law schools, police academies, and civil rights workshops, a moment of injustice transformed into a tool for justice. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that dignity and justice sometimes require us to stand firm even when the world tries to drag us down, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that reveal truth in moments of crisis, that show how ordinary people can transform systems simply by refusing to be invisible. Remember that every time we speak truth to power, every time we refuse to let assumptions go unchallenged, every time we stand up for ourselves or others, we write a new page in a long story of justice. Your voice matters. Your dignity is non-negotiable. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is hold up your truth like a badge in the sunlight and demand to be seen for who you really are.